You wouldn't say something as troublesome as inheriting now after being out of touch for 23 years, would you?
The woman who claimed to be my father's remarriage partner was very assertive. She insisted that the inheritance of my deceased father, whom she had taken care of until the end, belonged to her. Of course, I had no objections. I didn't want a single yen of the inheritance from my father who had abandoned me, his daughter.
Hurry up and sign that paper. Abandon the inheritance officially.
At that moment, my grandfather stopped me from signing as prompted. His eyes were burning with intense anger as he stared at my father's remarriage partner. My name is Sarah. I'm 29 years old. Since graduating from university, I've been working as an administrative assistant at an insurance agency. I'm in my late 20s, unmarried, and have no boyfriend. It's not that I don't want to get married, but I just can't bring myself to date men. The reason is simple: I have a distrust of men. The cause lies with my father. My father David disappeared 23 years ago after leaving me with my grandfather. The reason was probably my mother's death. My mother died in a traffic accident when I was 5 years old and my father was 35 years old. According to my grandfather, my father was so depressed that he couldn't hear the voices around him. Perhaps he lost confidence in living together, so he left me with his parents and disappeared.
Sarah did nothing wrong. Poor thing. You can rely on your grandparents.
I still can't forget the sad expression on my grandfather's face at that time. However, strangely enough, I can't remember what kind of face my father left me with. I think I wanted to forget the existence of my father who abandoned me as soon as possible. It was about 5 years after that when I heard a rumor that my father had remarried. The estrangement between me and my father lasted for 23 years. The only thing I truly believed in was the love of my grandparents and deceased mother. To be honest, I hated my father from the bottom of my heart. The fact that I was a child abandoned by his parents tormented me deeply. It was especially painful when I was in elementary and junior high school because there were only families with both parents around me. I have been teased or harassed for not having parents many times. There were times when I got into a big fight with someone and my grandparents were called out.
You were teased for not having parents? That's their fault. Sorry, Sarah. You're the only one who has a hard time. Grandpa and Grandma are always on your side.
Even such kind grandparents have been angry with me before. It was because I was much worse at controlling my emotions than now. I still can't forget the self-hatred at that time. Because I felt pathetic and regretted being abandoned, I hated my father even more. There are countless unpleasant things that children do when they don't have parents. Among them, it is particularly easy to understand the feeling of alienation felt on Father's Day or Mother's Day. As part of recreation, there were times when we drew portraits of our parents. There were also classmates who prepared presents happily on their parents' birthdays or wedding anniversaries. At such times, kind classmates left me alone. That kindness made me feel even more painful, but who should I complain to? Gradually, I became more isolated. What was fortunate for me without parents was that the grandparents who took me in were relatively wealthy. My grandfather is a former lawyer and is still relied upon by people in the area even now that he is old. My grandmother is always kind and good at cooking, and she treated me, who had no cuteness, very carefully.
You don't have to worry about money. You can do any hobby you want, and if you ever want to go to college, Grandpa and Grandma will help you properly.
Instead of directly venting anger at my father, I had all the love of my grandparents as much as I wanted. I wanted anything I wanted and sometimes said something outrageous. A rational grandfather didn't spoil me like that.
Grandpa can only buy what you need for Sarah. If you just want something, you can't buy it for you. It's not because Grandpa is stingy that he says this kind of thing. It's because Grandpa doesn't want Sarah to become an adult who spends money recklessly.
Grandfather is really a solid person. He is really kind, but not always so. He could be very strict at times and wouldn't forgive me for being spoiled. I often felt lonely when I went out with my grandparents. On holidays, when we went shopping at commercial facilities, there were family members everywhere you looked. Children who listened to their whimsical requests. Siblings who get along well by obediently listening to each other's words. Parents and children who enjoy the same game at the game center. Couples who look happily at their healthy children. Even though I had grandparents, there were no parents around me. Commercial facilities were places that confronted me with such reality. Why only me? There were many times when I felt such thoughts. There are many people in the world who live under worse conditions than mine. Although it was understood in my head, there was no way to fill the loneliness or pain unique to myself alone. My grandparents understood well the unbearable pain that I had. One day, my grandfather made me such a proposal.
If Sarah really wants to, she can use the foster care system. You can live with a couple of the same age as your real parents as a family. However,
my grandfather cut off his words and shed tears. It was the first time I had seen my grandfather cry.
Grandpa and Grandma really care about Sarah and love her very much. If you say you're in pain, you have to withdraw. Honestly, even talking about this is painful. But if it's for you.
My grandfather couldn't speak until the end. Rather, I didn't let him speak. I'm not going to leave Grandpa and Grandma behind, am I? Don't ever talk about adoption again. My home is here. This place where Grandpa and Grandma are is my place. If I just kept grieving, my grandparents would feel sad too. The time has come for me to face myself firmly. I thought so strongly. I accepted myself as a child abandoned by my parents and still lived positively. Thanks to the abundant love of my grandparents, I had become strong before I knew it. The passing of my grandmother due to illness was 20 years after my father abandoned me. It had been a long time since I had to say goodbye to someone so close. I was extremely sad, but my grandfather was calm and collected. He even had the composure to comfort me. I felt puzzled that my grandfather, who should have been the one grieving the most, was so composed.
I was prepared for this day to come someday. We talked a lot while we were still alive and were ready to say goodbye. That's why I'm surprised at how well I'm holding up. It's strange.
My grandparents' parting was very peaceful. Everyone in the family praised their parting as something they would want for themselves, and I was proud too. While my grandmother was being cremated, one of my aunts approached me with an apologetic look on her face.
I'm sorry to bring this up at a time like this,
she said, and showing me a picture of a man and asking if I would consider marriage. She knew it would be frowned upon, but she brought it up anyway. She looked genuinely sorry about it. Surprisingly, my grandfather smiled when he heard about it.
That's great news. You should definitely consider it. Think of your aunt's feelings.
My grandfather said that, but I couldn't feel the same way. Because of the painful experience of being abandoned by my father, I had become distrustful of men. While I admired the kind of relationship my grandparents had, I couldn't bring myself to hope for marriage. In my heart, such an intractable dilemma had taken shape. 3 years after my grandmother's passing, my grandfather approached me with a serious look on his face and said he had something to tell me.
David seems to have passed away in the hospital.
It was then that I learned for the first time that my father had been seriously ill. In fact, my grandfather had been in touch with him through his lawyer friends in recent years. The news of his death also came from those lawyer friends.
I heard that the funeral is the day after tomorrow. I'm going to go. What about you, Sarah?
After thinking about it, I decided not to attend the funeral. I didn't ask for any details like the address. My grandfather said he would leave it up to me. My father and I had cut ties 23 years ago. I don't have any hatred left for him now, but I don't feel like mourning him either. The next day, my grandfather took the train to visit his deceased son. I, who was left behind, reflected on the fact that I had no parents. There was no point in blaming my mother who had passed away in an accident. On the other hand, I still feel dissatisfied with my father's decision to leave me with my grandparents and cut off contact. It's just so pathetic for a person to leave their child's upbringing to their parents and cut off contact. I don't know what he was thinking, but couldn't he have done something else? A few years later, he remarried another woman. I can hardly understand it. But then again, I think to myself that there are fathers out there who are worse than mine. Fathers who are abusive, addicted to gambling or alcohol, antisocial, criminals. Compared to such monstrous fathers, maybe my father wasn't so bad after all. After all, for these past 23 years, he has never caused me any direct trouble. From the fact that he secretly communicated with my grandfather through a third party without telling me, it is clear that my father actively and thoroughly avoided any communication with me. He erased his own existence so as not to trouble my heart. Maybe that was his way of showing sincerity towards me. When I was 5 years old, I felt that my father was an awkward and unsociable person even though I was just a child. Until the very end, my father was just as I had imagined him back then. I now regret that I never heard his thoughts from his own mouth. After my father's funeral, a woman I didn't know visited me. She was probably in her 40s and had a very strong personality with distinctive heavy makeup.
You're Sarah, right? I knew it right away. You look a lot like David.
I had an intuition that she was my father's new wife. The woman named Taylor handed me some documents.
I came here today to ask you to renounce your inheritance, Sarah.
According to Taylor, my father had about 20 million yen in savings. If things continue as they were, Taylor and I would split the savings in half. She said that was unacceptable.
Don't you think so? I took care of David until the end, so it's only natural that I should get his money.
She said it was ridiculous for someone who hadn't been in touch for years to suddenly claim their rights. Yes, I understand, I replied. But if you don't mind, could you tell me what kind of life my father led?
What kind of life? It was a boring everyday life. He didn't drink or smoke. He didn't play pachinko, slots, or horse racing. He either read books all day or sat in front of his computer writing articles.
My father worked as a writer and would write anything if asked to do so: internet news, SEO articles, novels, scenarios. Even when he became bedridden due to illness in his later years, he continued writing. I was struck by an unexpected feeling. A self-centered father was suited for a lazy life like that. Although I had thought so somewhere in my heart, I couldn't imagine my father as a stoic writer. At the same time, I was beginning to lose sight of who my father really was. It wasn't an easy feat to accumulate 20 million yen through writing work alone. It wasn't an ordinary effort. Why did someone who could be so devoted to something abandon his duty to raise his daughter?
Come on, isn't it enough? Sign it quickly. What's wrong? You haven't been in touch for 23 years, and now you're saying you want to inherit it?
Of course, I was going to abandon the inheritance. I don't want anything that someone who abandoned his daughter left behind.
What are you doing? Sign that paper quickly. Officially abandon the inheritance.
As I was prompted to sign, my grandfather came and stopped me. My grandfather, who faced Taylor head-on, looked angry no matter how you looked at him.
How dare you come all the way here so easily? I told you not to come.
Father-in-law. Don't be so cold, W. I'm your daughter-in-law, you know?
I don't remember recognizing you. And you like David's money more than David himself, don't you?
So that's not true. It's just like I said at the funeral.
The grudge between my grandfather and Taylor. I had no idea what it was. My grandfather explained it to me as I was bewildered.
It's true that David remarried Taylor. David regretted it. Taylor is promiscuous, spends a lot of money, and hardly takes care of her sick husband.
So that's why it's a lie. Who said such a thing? The lawyer? Hey, Sarah, just sign it already. Abandon the inheritance.
That's impossible. David's will says he will leave all his property to his daughter Sarah.
Will.
I was as surprised as Taylor. It was the first time I heard about my father's will. My grandfather nodded deeply as he looked into my eyes.
Don't worry. The will has not been opened yet. It has to be verified by the court. The reason Grandpa knows the contents of the will is because David read the letter attached to the will.
Father's letter.
Yes. It's written in that letter. He decided to leave all his property to Sarah. And your infidelity is also written there. There are also photos of evidence. David doesn't want to leave anything to you.
Taylor slumped down in disappointment. The words, "there are also photos of evidence," may have had an effect on her. She seemed to have given up because she could no longer escape. I was still confused. Leaving property to a daughter who was supposed to have been abandoned? For what purpose? My grandfather smiled sadly as he sensed my confusion.
I'm sorry for keeping silent for so long, Sarah. Your father didn't hate you and abandon you. He had no choice but to leave you with Grandpa and Grandma because of his illness.
Actually, my father had the same illness as my grandmother when he was young. After his wife died in an accident, he seriously thought about it. If he continued to raise his daughter like this, he would eventually become a big burden for her. And that day could come at any time. His daughter might become a so-called young carer. Rather than letting that happen, it would be better to be hated for life and cut off the relationship completely. It was an extremely extreme choice, typical of a clumsy and unsociable father. Knowing everything, I felt indescribable. I was actually loved by my father.
Taylor, are you obsessed with inheritance because you want to use David's legacy to pay off your debts? Unfortunately, you won't get a penny.
This is the worst.
You must be disappointed. You approached David for money from the beginning, didn't you?
Taylor let out a big sigh. It seems that she hit the nail on the head. She hung her head and went home with a heavy heart. It was the moment when Taylor's debt repayment life, which would continue for many years to come, was confirmed. After Taylor left, my grandfather apologized to me again.
I'm sorry I kept it a secret. I couldn't tell you because of my promise to David.
My grandfather seemed relieved. Only he was feeling refreshed. I was still feeling confused. After all, my father's negative evaluation has been going on for 23 years. It can't be changed easily. It will probably take time. For now, I wanted to read the letter my grandfather mentioned. That's where the story begins. If I'm satisfied with everything, I'll inherit the inheritance for the first time. And then I'll go to my father's grave right away. I'll probably tell my father how grateful I am for the first time. I was looking forward to that moment. Here's my last gift, said the husband as he handed over the divorce papers. I've decided to remarry, so thanks for being my ATM all this time. Here is the story of my revenge against my husband, who was a terrible person. My name is Helen, and I am 50 years old this year. Tomorrow is a special day for me because our family's long-standing debt will finally be paid off. My husband and I got married 20 years ago when I was 30 and he was 35. He inherited a liquor store from his deceased parents, while I was working as a company employee. We started dating with the intention of getting married through an introduction from an acquaintance. I had only one worry. What if he asks me to help run the liquor store together? At that time, I was working as a financial planner, consulting insurance and finance for individual and corporate clients. I was earning a decent salary at the age of 30 and loved my job. I was studying for qualifications to aim higher. However, when my husband proposed, he said this. I know you're working hard to get your qualifications, and I want to support you. There are employees and part-timers at the store, so we'll manage somehow. Pursue your dreams, Helen. His words were the reason we decided to get married. I thought I wanted to support such a generous person who was always on my side. As he promised at first, he should have managed our married life by doing his job and me doing mine. It was about a year after we got married when he went to work at the store on a day off when I was relaxing at home. When I vacuumed under the bed, a large amount of paper got caught in it. It hadn't even been 6 months since we moved in, so why were there papers here? When I picked up one piece of paper that had become crumpled, it said, "A dunning letter." The total amount of debt borrowed in my husband's name was $150,000. $150 is 000. It's not $15, right? My head spun. Why? Why did he hide such a large amount of debt? That day, I confronted my husband. What's going on? What is this debt? It's not like that. It's what my parents left behind. The situation was like this. The debt belonged to the liquor store that my husband ran rather than his personal debt. It seemed that his parents had borrowed money, but when my husband took over the store, he also inherited their debt. They didn't intend to abandon their inheritance because they had borrowed against the land and buildings of the store as collateral. Although it wasn't my husband's personal debt, it wasn't something that could be left alone. But don't you pay back every month with a dunning letter? I asked. I do pay back every month, but business depends on monthly sales figures. So there are times when it's difficult to pay back in tough months, but we have to pay salaries to employees and part-timers anyway, so we wait for repayment for that part too. The dunning letter is from that time. At first glance, the husband's opinion seems reasonable, but I don't think it's good to delay repayment. In fact, the dunning letter even had the words "final notice" written on it. I didn't want to worry Helen, so I kept quiet. But everything is really okay. The store is doing well and we haven't been kicked out of our house, right? That's true, but... Then my husband said something like this to me as I looked at him anxiously. If you're so worried, why don't you pay off my debt with Helen's salary? You makes quite a bit, don't you? Huh? Is that how it is? It's not even my shop. But my husband continued. After all, couples are supposed to help each other out. My debt is Helen's debt too. But even if you say that all of a sudden, is it okay for Helen if my shop goes under? There are a lot of people who would be in trouble if that store disappeared. I was taken aback by what he said. In reality, my husband's liquor store had become an indispensable part of the community. The store was located in the suburbs where there were few convenience stores or supermarkets nearby, so unlike a regular liquor store, it also handled fresh foods such as meat and fish and offered home delivery services. I visited the store several times and it was always busy. There were even customers who boasted that they were glad this store existed. Please. I'll manage the store somehow. So please help me with the debt repayment. I liked seeing my husband work hard and take his business seriously. I didn't want his shop to disappear. I thought that being married meant supporting each other no matter what. If my husband was struggling now, it seemed natural for me to help him. Okay, I understand. Let's pay back as much as we can from my salary every month. You should focus on running the shop. I can provide money, but only my husband can run that shop. More than anything else, I was happy that my husband relied on me. However, he changed after this. About 3 years had passed since I took over his debt repayment. Recently, he had been coming home late more often. What are you doing at this hour? Ugh, you smell like alcohol. Just hanging out with some people. Helen, did you finish paying off this month? For some reason, my husband approached me with a domineering attitude. I already transferred the money last week. Why are you asking me that? My shop depends on you. So please keep paying back properly from now on. Recently, when he got drunk first, he would say things like that. I didn't pay attention to his drunken ramblings before, but now it doesn't feel good when he says it so many times. Isn't it like paying off your debt is just a matter of course for me? By the way, George is having his 3rd child. Lucky guy. George is one of my husband's classmates who runs his own business like him, and his wife works with him at their shop too. Speaking of which, there's something I need to tell my husband. Don't you think we should have a child soon too? But my husband's reaction was very cold. A child? This is the busiest time for the store right now. Besides, we have debts to pay off. How can you say something so carefree? Isn't it your death? But I held back and said. But George has children too, right? We should have them too. George has both parents alive and his wife works at their shop too. It's different from us. There's nothing more I can do if he says that. My desire to have children that I had when we got married was completely crushed. So, from now on, I can't do anything until I pay off my debt? Well, that's right. If you earn a lot and repay the debt quickly, I'll consider it. The hatred swelled up in me as I looked at my husband's face, which was laughing cruelly. The sense of urgency to repay the debt as soon as possible also sprouted. It's scary. Even though it was an unreasonable demand, I didn't even have the luxury of thinking about it carefully. After that, I worked hard for my husband. I actively acquired qualifications, took promotion exams and won salary increases. I started earning much more than women of the same age and also made advance payments on my debt. But the debt did not decrease easily. Before I knew it, I was over 40 and had to give up on having children. But it was okay, because my husband was there. I could do my best for him and he relied on me. As long as I believed that, I was happy. My husband's return became later and later, sometimes even becoming a morning return. Looking at my husband working desperately to protect his store, I felt that I had to work hard as a wife too. Because he was doing his best, I could do my best too. And time passed, and the day came when the repayment ended. Tomorrow is the last day of payment. For this debt, I have endured various luxuries. But from tomorrow, that will be gone too. You can use your own money as you like. Come to think of it, since we got married, we haven't traveled or eaten delicious food because we've been thinking too much about money. We are still in our 50s. We thought we would enjoy such things from now on. And on the day of repayment completion, I took a paid leave. I made a more luxurious dinner than usual and prepared wine and chocolate cake that my husband likes. Let's celebrate the repayment together and have fun. That's what I thought. When my husband returned from work and saw them lined up on the table. Finally. It seemed like 20 years, but it went by in no time, you know. He said to me. However, my husband trembled and bowed his head while still shaking with excitement. I thought he might be happy and crying. But then he suddenly began to laugh loudly in a way that I had never heard before. What? What happened? Immediately after that, the man who should have been my husband said something unbelievable. Today only, you're fired. Well, thank you for these 20 years, I really appreciate it. Thanks to you for paying off all the debt, I'm free now. So thanks for your hard work so far, but you're no longer needed. What? What do you mean? I couldn't understand what he was saying and asked him again. Then my husband took something out of his pocket. Here's the last present I'll give you. The green letters, divorce papers, were projected onto my eyes. My husband became proud and continued. I decided to remarry. You're useless now that you're old. Thanks for being an ATM all this time. Remarry, have you been cheating all along? Come to think of it, my husband often came home late for work or socializing. Maybe this person, while I was working hard to repay the debt. But his expression remained proud. I would never cheat on you like that. I've already found a new wife candidate. I want to divorce you and marry her. That's why I've been waiting for this day. The day you finish paying off your debts. At his cruel words, tears welled up in my eyes. The food I had prepared looked blurry, which made it even more painful. So, get out of here already. My husband handed me the divorce papers. At this point, anger was boiling inside me more than sadness or emptiness. Fine. Do you have any regrets? I asked him, twisting the words out of my mouth. Regrets? Why would I regret divorcing an old hag like you? I've already found someone better. Old hag? If I'm an old hag, then he's definitely an old man. How long does he plan on pretending to be young? At his ridiculousness, I regained my composure and took the divorce papers. I'll take these for now. I'll contact you later. I said that and packed my things before leaving the house. To think that our 20-year marriage could end so easily. It wasn't until I was alone that I finally cried from sadness and regret. After that, I consulted a lawyer to draft a divorce agreement. I also hired a private investigator to look into my husband's new partner and received a report on them. The agreement was sent to my husband by the lawyer. Then, he immediately called me. "Hey, Helen. What is this document?" I could imagine his face turning red with anger even over the phone. In contrast to him, I remained calm. "It's a divorce agreement. What about it?" "I know that. What I'm talking about is this debt repayment thing. Why do I have to pay you back?" My husband was losing his mind. "This is about repaying the debt between us during our marriage." In other words, he wanted me to return the money that I had paid off instead of him. Why should I? You were just doing me a favor by repaying it. Why are you bringing up the past now? What are you talking about? You were just repaying it as my wife. It's different now that we're getting divorced. So what about your supposed regrets? Did you just realize that now? When my husband first brought up divorce, I immediately thought about repaying this debt. As someone who deals with insurance and finance on a daily basis, I often hear stories from various clients. Sometimes, they talk about divorce or inheritance issues. Thanks to that experience, it occurred to me not to sign the divorce papers right away but to go through a lawyer first. The amount of money that I had paid off instead of my husband was over $200,000 including interest. Since I had paid it all off myself, it was only natural for me to claim it back from him. That's all there is to it. My husband was completely taken aback by my firm attitude and the document with the lawyer's name on it. He had thought he could kick me out without paying any compensation or alimony. He really was clueless. "You don't have that kind of money." "Really? Then why don't you sell your store for funds?" "If I did that, there would be nothing left for me." "Are you some kind of demon? Aren't you still 55 years old? You can still work if you want to." I didn't feel any objections during my conversation with my husband and wanted to hang up soon, but there was one more thing I wanted to confirm. "By the way, what happened with your remarriage?" "That's none of your business." At his lackluster response, I couldn't help but burst out laughing. "Sure, that might be the case. It sounds like you're going through a lot, so hang in there." As I was about to hang up the phone, my husband clung to me and said, "Wait, Helen. I'm not going to remarry. I want to try again with you." I told him this before hanging up. "Try again? Don't make me laugh. I'm rejecting you." I had been married to this man for 20 years. To an outsider, I might have looked ridiculous. But until he brought up divorce, I had respected him quite a bit. It was because I saw how hard he worked for his shop and customers that I was able to support him. But after 20 years, it turned out that he was just a fool. The talk of remarriage was entirely his own idea. He had joked with a teenage part-time worker named Becky, saying, "Becky is cute. Will you be my wife?" Becky had jokingly replied, "Well, if you let me be a housewife." He misunderstood her joke as being serious. When Becky realized how serious he was, she naturally freaked out. The situation escalated to the point where her parents threatened to sue him. When I saw the report from the private investigator, I laughed so hard that my stomach hurt. Come to think of it, my husband would come home late. I thought he was just a hard worker who was passionate about his job, but it was actually the opposite. He would often flirt with young girls at his favorite bars and clubs. He would say things like, "I'm surprisingly popular with younger girls, and I can get along with anyone because I'm a businessman." He would make girls uncomfortable by saying things like that. To him, I was no longer useful as an old wife and he only saw me as an ATM. His misunderstanding was so ridiculous that no one took him seriously and he almost got into trouble with the police for stalking. Cheating on me might have been better than what he did. He couldn't even stand on the ring of infidelity. But why did he come up with the idea of remarrying a younger girl in the first place? Apparently, it was because his friend George had become a grandfather. This is what George told me. As soon as he saw my grandchild, he said he wanted a child too. Even though his wife had been paying off their debts until then, she told him off for saying something like that. Who knew he would do something like this? George was speechless. "I'm glad I don't have to spend my old age with such a man." I muttered those words to myself. After that, I divorced my husband. Since the cost sharing between us was not clear, there was room for negotiation with my husband to reduce the amount. However, I think I gave up just because I received a claim from a lawyer. It's amazing that such a spineless person has been in business until now. My husband sold his store to repay me. Fortunately, just before my husband sold the store, part-time workers and a few employees had fled, so they were not affected. Apparently, customers scolded him for selling the store that he had inherited from his parents, but when they learned that the reason for the sale was to repay his ex-wife, all of them were disgusted. The true story, which is like a joke, spread throughout the region that he got what he deserved after divorcing me. Even if we didn't sell the store, it would have affected our business if our bad reputation had spread. On the other hand, it might have been better to sell it before going bankrupt. The money from selling the store alone is not enough to repay me, so my husband is now working part-time while continuing to repay me. Sometimes, I was wrong. Can we go back to how things were? What was wrong with me at that time? George shows off his grandchildren. I receive such messages. Unfortunately, even if I refuse to answer calls, they come from various places. I asked my lawyer to notify him that, if you contact your ex-wife again, I will file a complaint. Then they stopped calling me altogether. As usual, my husband was abnormally afraid of lawyers. By the way, please ask me about my current job. I started working at a marriage counseling office. When I turned 50 and wanted to try a new job, an acquaintance started a new counseling office and I quit my company and joined them. Now I am helping couples who want to get married and also providing advice on money troubles between couples and how to choose insurance. Since they are going to be married as a couple, they are very popular with customers who want to talk openly from the beginning. This service has grown rapidly since its inception. Especially for someone like me who has had various experiences, it is also intended not to make others fall into the same trap. Although my salary has decreased slightly compared to when I worked for a company, I am happy every day that I can help people become happy. As someone who cut off her husband and became happy, today I am working hard as a bridge of happiness for someone else.